Nosotros, mientras tanto, ahora ya sí, pasamos al análisis internacional, porque nos acompaña Simon Harvey desde Monex Europe and Canada, es el jefe de Forex. Simon, thank you so much for having us a few minutes. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Simon, today when we talk about ECB, the TLTRO, we have no surprises about these changes. We knew that the ECB was working in changes about the TLTRO, but we are afraid about a negative response or reaction from banks. I mean a breach of trust between banks and the ECB. Do you think that could happen?
Yeah, I mean, the TLTRO kind of readjustment or recalibration was always going to be the hot topic of this ECB meeting. We knew they were going to hike 75 basis points. They guided us towards this. We knew that they were most probably going to delay any quantitative tightening plans until Q1, and we knew that they weren't going to give us too much in the way of forward guidance. So it was a case of how are they going to stop this free arbitrage from the banks with regards to TLTRO, and there was no clean exit, essentially. You just mentioned that the current policy stance actually, erodes trust, that if they need to use a TLTRO option in the future, the banks will go, well, you're giving us these conditions to borrow at now, but we don't know what they're going to do to change in the future. The one kind of opposing argument to this is that it's not necessarily costing banks too much more. They've been given leeway to adjust their portfolios and their lending conditions appropriately to offset this impact. But what you do have, as you do say correctly, is that there is some sort of kickback here. But since the September meeting, they've been having free returns on these TLTRO operations if they've been managing them correctly. So, I mean, it swings and roundabouts. They had a free lunch. They've now had to pay for it. It could come back to bite the ECB in the future. But essentially, there was no clean exit. And even if you did kind of a reverse tiering option, it isn't necessarily, kind of without any consequences too.
And Christine Lagarde today didn't provide us any details about quantitative tightening. We don't know if they have discussed it about today, and we don't know what to expect from the next monetary policy meeting in December. What do you think?
Well, they didn't give us any forward guidance in the way of a dot plot or any kind of, we're not going to hike rates until X meeting that we're used to over the past 2 years. But if you read between the lines of what she's saying, there is some forward guidance there, in the sense that they have made substantial progress on the normalization cycle, that they are going to start actively discussing the quantitative tightening plans in the December meeting, and that the neutral rate doesn't necessarily mean it's the terminal rate. And when you kind of factor all of this together, we can say, okay, we have information that the neutral rate is between 1% and 2%. We're already halfway between that. We do know that they think more rate hikes are necessary, so they're going to carry on increasing. And they do think that the terminal rate, by delineating this from the neutral rate, is going to potentially be higher than 2%. So when you kind of factor all of that in together, we still think that the inflation conditions in Europe warrant, kind of a more aggressive stance on tackling inflation, especially before the economic kind of downturn really sets in going into Q1. And in this scenario, we expect then another 50 basis points, because they don't want to seem like they're not front-loading policy. Otherwise, it's just going to come back and have greater costs in the future. So we look for 50 basis points, but the difficulty is once you then get to 2%, you're in restrictive territory or going close to restrictive territory. It gets a lot harder for the ECB, and I think that's when we're going to go into a fine-tuning stage, where we're more likely to see 25 basis point hikes. And I think money markets and short-term interest rate markets have really come a long way with the guidance from the ECB today, and are actually falling in line with our base case that we're more likely to see a rate of around 2.25%, based on the current inflation and economic projections that we can make from the data. And that's pretty much what we think Lagarde was pointing to as well in her comments.
Well, and Christine Lagarde insisted in this meeting-by-meeting approach from the ECB and from next monetary policy meeting in December and from now. Where do you see the euro from now on?
Yeah, so the euro reaction to today's decision highlights one thing. The ECB is no longer a factor that can support it. We've already seen that they're laying the groundworks for more dovish guidance and a more dovish kind of path than markets are expecting in 2023 already, by saying substantial progress has been made on the normalization process. And therefore, it's very much dependent on the Fed side of the equation. And what we've seen so far is that global risk sentiment and cross-asset risk sentiment is much better supportive in this environment where we're starting to see US data show a slowdown in the US economy. The problem is that this is all well and good, but it's loosening financial conditions, which at a time where inflation is severely elevated in the US is against the Fed's wishes. So it wouldn't surprise me if these kind of risk conditions are completely nailed back down by the Fed next week, even when they do hike by 75 basis points as expected. So I think the prospects for the euro are still further downside from here. I think above parity, the going is going to be very tough, unless we start to see an actual pivot from the Federal Reserve, which fundamentally will require a much larger slowdown in the pace of inflation on a month-on-month basis than we're currently seeing. So we don't think it's going to happen this year. Any kind of bullish case for euro dollar from this point, I think we're going to see that in 2023. It's not a story for Q4.
And these are some of the key points of this ECB meeting. Thank you so much, Simon, Harvey, for having us a few minutes, and sorry for the delay of this interview.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Y nosotros por